Hello everyone, this week's devlog is a little different. This week, I wanted to challenge myself by designing a character in just 5 days in a totally different style. I decided to make a fan art of Son Goku from Dragon Ball. Here you can see a time lapse with commentary from beginning to end. To start, I would like to show you the two main references I used. One of the problems I had was to use references with different styles. The differences are not huge in the big picture, but when you look at the details they are. So I ended up making a mix of the two styles, which I think it was probably not the best. The first thing, as always, was to gather references. Once I had the references, I used them as a base to sculpt the main shapes of the anatomy. As you can see, I immediately put the spheres for the eyes. That always helps me to visualize better the face I'm sculpting. In this case, the eyes are very rectangular, so I change them to planes. These are temporary. Later I will put the spheres back again for the eyes. I adjust the anatomy having the reference in the background. What I like about sculpting in Blender is its simplicity. Normally I use 3 or 4 brushes. In this case I'm using the draw brush just to mark some shapes that I will soften later. When I sculpt, the process is adding volume and then smooth it, and I do that several times. One of the biggest challenges was translating 2D to 3D. Anime animators take a lot of liberties when creating characters, and sometimes their designs don't make much sense anatomically in 3D space. You will see me struggling in the video to get a satisfactory result. For the body, I use a base mesh. As the goal was to make the character in 5 days, I took some shortcuts. In this case, I'm marking the muscle groups because I'm looking for a more stylized and blocky anatomy. For that, I basically use 2 brushes, the clay strip and the pinch brush. I start with the hair using curves. Again, I pay a lot of attention to the references to get Goku's characteristic hairstyle. I didn't like how I did his shoulders, so I decided to redo it, adding more muscle definition. I took the opportunity to add more volume to his abs and break the planes a little bit more. Again, back to his head, I'm doing his eyebrows and readjusting his facial anatomy based on the second reference. My biggest problem is trying to get an anime anatomy, meanwhile my subconscious is creating the muscle groups, fat and skin that would be on a real face. So I cannot get the anime aesthetic I'm looking for. For the eyebrows, once I have the basic shape I like, I use the shrink wrap modifier to make the eyebrow follow the shape of the head. I add a subdivision modifier to add more resolution, a solidify modifier to give it more volume, and finally a bevel modifier to give the edges the look I want. Back to the hair, I use curves and the mirror modifier to repeat on both sides of the head the parts that can be symmetrical. Here I have switched to the boots. I like to switch from one thing to another and come back later with fresh eyes. That helps me to see possible mistakes and make the necessary adjustments. I use polygon modeling to get the basic shape of the boots. I add control edges that will help to keep the shape when I add the subdivision modifier for more resolution. And for the laces, I use the same technique I used in my tutorial on adding detail to models. I'll leave the link in the description. I use a rope model that I bought from a pack, and I reproduce the knot with curves. Once I have the knot, I use the array and curve modifier to extend the model of the rope along the whole curve. I used Marvelous Designer to design the pants by taking real patterns as references. I use different layers and materials so I can add the belt and the shirt that will be torn on top. Marvelous Designer requires some trial and error until you get the expected results. Back to Blender, I break the pants and shirt based on the original design reference. I'm sculpting the belt with the clay strip brush. To create the holes in the pants, I enter in sculpt mode, and using masks, I erase the part of the model for the holes. Then in edit mode, I fold part of the fabric to help the appearance of tearing. I'm adjusting the anatomy of the head again, adding more volume to the cheeks and trying to round his face. Now I replace the planes of the eyes with spheres, and I modify the Y scale to make them flatter. I start the retopology process. I made a mistake because later on I will be making adjustments on the sculpture, so I will have to readjust the topology a couple of times. For a good topology, it's very important to have loops around the eyes and mouth for a good deformation during animations. Again, I'm making more adjustments to his face, adding volume and smoothing. Looking at the reference, I try to make his eyes more rectangular and adding the marks under them, so characteristic of the Dragon Ball design. A trick I use many times to add more resolution while sculpting without remeshing the whole model is using the retopology. I take a brush that modifies the geometry like the clay strip and give it a string of 0. Then sculpting the area to add more resolution without deforming the form. I usually apply this to the face and hands where more geometry is needed for details. Back again to his head, I am adjusting the face, nose and other parts. As an advice, I would say never start to retopologize your model until you are 100% happy with your sculpture. Otherwise, you will be doing the work several times. Here I'm retopologizing his hands. I use a very good tutorial from Danny Mac in which explains the process for the whole body, breaking it by parts. I'll leave the link in the description in case you are interested. As you can see, retopology is a very long process, but if it's well done, it's very satisfying, especially when you start texturing. Here I'm making the retopology only of the elements that I need. We don't need the full body, so I'm just doing the parts visible from the holes in his pants. For the pants, initially I did it manually. You will see me trying different approaches. But finally, I used an add-on called Remesher to capture all the detail I wanted. The advantage of this add-on is it converts any model into nice quads, and you can choose the amount of quads that you want. It's very useful for retopology. The problem with this is it doesn't create loops for animation, so you have to be very careful, especially if you use it in organic shapes. I'll leave the link in the description if you are interested. In my case, I did a test with Mixamo and I saw how the geometry generated from the add-on deformed quite well. If I made the model for production, I would do it by hand and make sure there are loops for a good deformation. Normally, for my retopology process, I use the mirror and shrink wrap modifiers in conjunction with the snap face in edit mode. That sometimes gives problems when there are holes like the mouth, eyes or nostrils, so I wait to apply the modifiers to finish with those holes. Once all the retopology is done, I start the unwrapping process for the UVs. Here I had another problem. When I use curves with the mirror modifier, and I convert them to meshes, and I unwrap followed by active quad, all faces from the symmetric model got split, creating a mess in the UVs. You will see me fixing that later on. Thanks to the unwrapping, I'm realizing errors and gaps that I have left in the model, in his ears and hands. I'm unwrapping using 6 UV maps. That will be face and hands together, body, clothing, hair, eyes, and cornea. I use a wonderful add-on called UV Packmaster. It maximizes the use of the UV space so you can get more resolution with the same space. I'll leave the link in the description. When the UV is ready, I export the low and high poly version to bake the maps in Marmoset. During the baking, I realized the problem I introduced earlier with the hair UVs. To fix the issue, I ended up duplicating manually the symmetrical hair strands and doing the unwrap again. With the belt was another problem. I still had the mirror modifier, so one half of the belt had the same texture as the other side, resulting in a visual error. I applied the modifier and unwrap again to fix the problem. I noticed more errors, especially with the laces. When there are weird problems with shading, it's usually an indication of a problem with the normals. In this case, the normals were inverted and the shading was incorrect. I went back to Blender to flip the normals and fix the issue. When I was satisfied with the baking, I went to Substance Painter for texturing. My process is always very similar whether it's for skin, clothing or accessories. In general terms, I start with a layer for basic color, then I add another layer with a generator to bring more color variation. I add another layer with pore detail if it's for skin or fabric detail for clothing, etc. Then I use 2 more layers, adding dirt and curvature to add more realism and believability to the texture. Finally, I add small and finer details in the last layers. The texturing process is usually quite long since you can add more and more details and layers, so it's good to set a limit and stop when you're happy. You won't ever be 100% satisfied with the result. During the texturing of the face, I realized more issues with his face. So I went back to Blender to make adjustments in the sculpting, the geometry, and then baking again all the maps in Marmoset, and then back to Substance Painter. At this point, I don't advise making changes in the geometry because a small change implies many changes through the whole process. I repeat my texturing process for the clothing and boots, and as when I'm sculpting, I like to jump from one part of the model to another, so I can come back with fresh eyes to see what adjustments are needed. Here I'm doing something new, and that's painting fake shadows on the model. I think it helps to sell better the anime look. The shadows will be smooth with a blur filter and faded, lowering the opacity. I'm almost at the end of the process. I'm adding small details like fibers in the broken parts of the fabric, the fingernails. I apply a similar process of the fake shadows, but this time with the fake lights on Goku's hair. Finally, I add scratches on Goku's skin as part of the final process. After all, he was in a fight, and that needs to be obvious both in his clothing and body. Finally, I return to Marmoset for rendering. After adjusting the lining and recreating the materials, this is the final result. I hope you like it. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe and like the video. And if you want me to make another character, leave your suggestions in the comments. I will take them into account for future characters. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.